So, good morning. Welcome to the Data-Driven Safety Analysis Virtual Workshop Series presented in coordination with the Vision Zero Central Florida Initiatives, the Federal Highway Administration, and Metro Plan Orlando. This workshop series will explore how geometric road design, traffic control, and other factors affect roadway safety. Participants will learn crash prediction methodologies from the AASHTO Highway Safety Manual. My name is Taylor Laurent from Metro Plan Orlando, and I'm excited to welcome you to the first of these 3 workshops. Today's workshops will be recorded and available to rewatch on the Metro Plan Orlando YouTube channel. If you have any questions during today's session, please type your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. This workshop will be led by John McFadden. John is a senior geometric design and safety engineer for the Federal Highway Administration's Resource Center. He provides technical assistance and technology deployment services for the agency on data analytical applications in geometric design and highway safety. John has published several journal papers focusing on geometric design of highways, traffic safety, and operations. He also served as a panel member of various research projects sponsored by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Prior to joining FHWA, John worked with the University of Alabama as a faculty member in civil and environmental engineering, as well as various consulting positions. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to John to start our training.
Hey, thank you very much, Taylor. Welcome, everyone. I'm glad to see we have a nice group together to talk about data-driven safety analysis. And to tee this topic up, I'm going to share my screen here and start by talking about an experience over the last few years that really has caused nationally the highway safety program to pivot and try and rethink how we do things. And I'm going to start by looking at some of the data that led to this change or pivot as it relates to how we are focusing on dealing with highway safety and specifically the number of fatal and serious injury crashes that result. So if you, let me also preface this by saying, I'm going to show a few different references as a part of today and tomorrow, as well as next week. And these reference materials will be provided, all of the sites and under other links that I use within the context of this workshop will be shared with you. So the first one I'm showing you is FARS, and you don't need to wait for me to share this link with you, as you could just Google the Fatal Analysis Reporting System. But if you do, under FARS, you can go in and check out from a historical perspective, running queries on the number of fatal crashes and fatalities that resulted from those crashes over the past 30 plus years. The data is available. And of particular interest here for me is what occurred in 2020. Because if you look, the first, what I'm highlighting here are the total number of fatal crashes. And then what's really more important are the total number of fatalities that resulted from those crashes. So you'll see in 2020, highlighted there in blue, there were 38,824 deaths as a result of traffic crashes. The reason this, I mean, the numbers themselves are astounding, and it's by definition, there's no acceptable number of fatals. But what really makes this discouraging is in 2020, as a result of COVID, the amount of VMTs was drastically reduced. And one of my thoughts as we were going through the COVID experience was, well, as a result of this, my expectation was, given that the country basically shut down, the world for that matter shut down, my expectation was we should have a drastic reduction in the number of deaths as a result of traffic crashes. And yet what we saw was an actual increase from the prior year, 36,355 to 38,824. And this led to and kind of accelerated the shift in how we deal with traffic safety to deploy a new fundamental approach called the safe system approach that I'll touch on as well as a part of the presentation. But here are the national data, and you can track over the past 30 plus years. If you go back to, I remember back in 2010, 11, 12, after the financial the financial collapse back in 2008, we saw a reduction in the number of fatals and reduction in exposure that had me, somewhat optimistic when we were seeing a reduction from 45,000 fatals that occurred, or I guess it was 43,510 back in 2005. We got down to 32,479 in 2011. And, I've been with Fed Highway since 2001. I felt like we were gaining momentum and really and having an impact on the reduction. And then what occurred since then was a slow migration back to the levels that we were at prior. Now we haven't exceeded 40,000 yet, but it does represent an area of concern. And then if we focus in on Florida specifically, you can also, and how did I get here? If you go back to the FAR's website and you look under the states and click on the states, you can then find the Florida data in there. And that's what would lead me to showing you this table. And you can see over the past 20, 30 years, I think it goes back as far as, let me see here, 2000, or 1994, there were 2,687. And in 2020, we're 3,331 fatals. So it feels like in Florida, that value of, on average each year, you're losing about 3,000 people as a result of traffic crashes. And in past years, you can see you all in Florida were bottoming out in 2011 as well with 2,400. And then we saw the same movement as we've seen nationally. So with Fed Highway, I've gotten involved over the past 10 years in how to deploy data-driven tools to address this safety problem. And that led me to, I wanted to share with you Federal Highway's data and analysis tool website. So we have this site here, that RSDP, our Roadway Safety Data Program, that provides a lot of information related to what we're going to cover today, tomorrow, and next Friday. And we do provide support as it relates to deploying data-driven safety analysis, which, if I segue, I was one of the co-leads for this Everyday Counts initiative. And as a part of this Everyday Counts initiative, what my role was to promote the deployment of and use of data-driven analytics to help make more informed investment decisions about highway safety. So within these sites, you'll be able to see a bunch of different resources related to DDSA. And I'm kind of framing this before getting to the Highway Safety Manual, because the Highway Safety Manual is one tool that falls under the umbrella of data-driven safety analysis. And that's going to be the primary discussion topic over the next 3 lectures, today, tomorrow, and next Friday. But I do want to put it in its proper perspective relative to the larger umbrella of data-driven safety analysis, which also falls under a program that we're promoting now, that is the safe system approach. And I will deliver a short presentation on the safe system approach later today, but just introducing it to kind of tee up our discussion today. what we're doing within the safe system approach is kind of this shift or pivot that I spoke of as a result of not just the COVID shutdown and seeing an increase in fatals, but more broadly, over the past 20 years, seeing this random fluctuations up and down nationally of about 35 to 40,000 fatals a year and saying, okay, the standard operating procedures by themselves haven't put a big dent in reducing the number of fatals. Let's try something that's been tested internationally and been successful and see if it will be effective here in the US. And that is namely the safe system approach. And as a result, this safe system approach is based on these, this site describes what the around the perimeter of that circle captures the theme of this safe system approach. At the very top at 12 o'clock there, if I zoom in a bit, just bear with me, I think everybody can readily get on board with the idea that death and serious injury as a result of traffic crashes is unacceptable. Now, if we move and go clockwise around the perimeter here, at 1 o'clock, you can see human beings make mistakes. So this is basically a shift in our mentality of the idea that we are now, within the infrastructure perspective, going to be designing and accounting for this acknowledgement that the people we are designing for, we are all humans, we make errors as a part of our day-to-day activities. This at 4 o'clock on this little pie chart here, you see human beings are vulnerable. So now we recognize we make mistakes and we're vulnerable, and we're going to use that vulnerability, meaning the human being's tolerable threshold to absorb energy, as one of the criteria in assisting with different designs that we may put out there. We're going to share responsibility, meaning from Federal Highways perspective, we're responsible for the infrastructure elements. We're going to work closely with NHTSA, who's responsible for in-vehicle technologies and human behavior. And we're going to also work with EMS in an effort to get response and medical services to the sites where these crashes occur more rapidly. And then users as well, coordinating and making sure that users share responsibility as we promote and deliver a safe system approach to achieve improved highway safety performance. Then when we get to about 7 o'clock on the chart here, safety is proactive. So we're trying to now initiate programs that are not reactive, but rather focused on high-risk locations that will yield and deliver an impact in reducing fatal and serious injury crashes for modest costs, meaning we have limited resources within our jurisdictions focused on highway safety. And what we're trying to achieve here is, through the delivery of a safe system approach using data-driven safety analysis, identifying the combination of project and design that yields the biggest return on investment. So that means for every dollar we spend, we want to save the most lives and injuries given the resources available to us. And a key to that are data-driven analytics. Specifically, as a part of DDSA, will be the Highway Safety Manual. And then at 11 o'clock on this figure, you can see redundancy is crucial. This kind of captures the idea that we cannot achieve the highest level of design for every section of roadway throughout the country. And a good example of redundancy in this case, as it relates to, for instance, two-lane rural highways where we may have rumble strips on the roadway. And rumble strips are pretty common low-cost countermeasure. It's a proven safety countermeasure that has been deployed for 20 plus, more than probably 25, 30 years now. And it's highly effective. But there may be some gaps in the roadway network. And now with vehicle technology, many of you may be driving cars that are monitoring where your relative position of the vehicle is with respect to the travel lane, and sends an alert to the driver, or compensates if the driver were to leave the travel way and enter the shoulder or opposing lane, it would alert and prevent the driver from doing so. So that's an example of how a system could be redundant, where the in-vehicle technology in combination with rumble strips, for example, is ensuring that drivers remain in their travel lanes. This safe system approach, as I mentioned, is a bit of a shift, but it also deploys as a part of it data-driven safety analytics to help achieve our larger goal of zero fatals, zero serious injuries as a result of traffic crashes. And that finally leads me to the last website I wanted to share in the introductory parts of this presentation, which reflects our proven safety countermeasures. And these are different techniques that have been deployed and vetted, and the impact or effect of these treatments has been quantified through typically crash modification factors that capture, by installing or using these treatments or policy decisions, what impact that will have in terms of the expected crashes reduced from the delivery of this. And you can see they're captured across different discipline areas: speed management, ped bikes, roadway departure, intersections, and then some cross-cutting countermeasure. The idea here is, given the fact that nationally we have limited resources within our jurisdictions, it's really incumbent upon us to make sure when we select projects and designs or specific treatments for a project that we have a level of comfort with the expected return. And that return is the number of crashes by severity that will be reduced given the investment that we have in each or any of these treatments that we would consider deploying. And without this knowledge, it's very difficult for us to be able to differentiate between what project and what design will yield the biggest return on investment. It's not until the last 15 or so years where we were developed, or where we have seen models developed that quantify the safety effects of design decisions, that allow us to now make comparisons across different designs to be able to select what combination of design and project yields the expected biggest return on our investment. Okay, and as Taylor said, if you have any questions at any time, please just type them in the chat pod. I'm going to every once in a while go back and excuse me, and refer to those questions as I proceed through the content. The first major reference that you'll see I'll refer to throughout the day over the next 3 sessions is the highwaysafetymanual.org site. And within this site, you'll see under tools, there's going to be a series of different software tools that are available for download that help us deploy these highway safety manual support software tools. And I'm going to focus on part C, the predictive methods, specifically these 4 Excel spreadsheets. And for the purpose of what we're going to be covering today and as a part of this workshop, we're focused on interchange, freeways, ramps, ramp junctions, which is the Enhanced Interchange Safety Analysis Tool, or ISAT-E, that I'll be using tomorrow and illustrating the content and application of this spreadsheet to do data-driven safety analysis. But I didn't want to just go forward without mentioning that the HSM has the ability to predict crash frequencies for other facility types beyond freeways or full access control facilities, freeways, ramps, ramp junctions. Specifically, you can do 2-lane rural highways, multi-lane rural highways, urban, suburban roadways as well. And the spreadsheets are all listed here. I would also, and you'll be getting an email from Taylor that shows a list of references that have the specific research reports, be they NCHRP for the multi-lane rural and urban suburban and ISAT-E, or a Fed Highway report for 2-lane rural highways. That is the research behind what's in those spreadsheets, and in fact represent the chapters within the Highway Safety Manual. And the reason I share that is many jurisdictions, especially local jurisdictions, may not have copies of the Highway Safety Manual available. It is a publication offered through AASHTO, and it's not cheap. It's $500, at over $500. So there's some jurisdiction where that is a cost that they don't have the money to be able to absorb. So it does not preclude us at the local level or for our jurisdiction, if we don't have access to the Highway Safety Manual, it doesn't necessarily preclude us from deploying DDSA, as the research related to this content is available publicly. And I put that in a Word document that you'll be getting via email over the next day or so. So with that, and here's the Word, the Word document. It kind of has the HSM website, CMF Clearinghouse, and then the research reports for 2-lane rurals, multi-lane rurals, urban, suburban, and freeways and interchanges. And if you notice on that freeways and interchanges, which is the focus of this workshop, it is a result of an NCHRP project, NCHRP 1745. And if you click on that link, it will take you to this report that you can then download. And this is the research that was used and to develop the content that's included in the ISAT-E spreadsheet. So with this spreadsheet and this reference document, you can deploy the HSM methodologies for freeways, ramps, ramp junctions, interchange analysis. So I kind of throw that, it's like kind of like drinking from a fire hydrant here, but I put all this material out there initially to show what it is I'm drawing from as I deliver the presentation today, tomorrow, and then next Friday as well on IHSDM. All right, so before I get started with the PowerPoint, let me double check any questions or comments at this point.
We do not have any open questions in the Q&A feature at the moment.
Great. Thanks, Tim. All right, then I'm going to jump into the content here and go right to the PowerPoint. And this, again, is a workshop that we typically deliver over 2 to 3 full days. So I want to also manage expectations. As a part of this delivery, I'm going to kind of give you from 30,000 feet. So I'm able in 3 hours today, 3 hours tomorrow, and 3 hours next Friday to kind of touch on the general topics we cover as a part of a full 3-day workshop where we go through. And if you can imagine, that NCHRP 1745 is a pretty lengthy document. There's a lot of content in there. And in fact, were I to deliver this workshop, oftentimes it's packaged. We do 2-lane rurals, multi-lane rurals, urban, suburban, and then we do the freeways, ramps, ramp junctions. Now I can do 2-lane rural, multi-lane rural, urban, suburban in a day and a half. And you would walk away feeling, I think, relatively comfortable applying the concepts for those facility types, the data-driven safety analysis for those facility types, and it wouldn't be that heavy a lift. Freeways, ramps, ramp junctions is a little bit more detailed, and there's a little more to it than what's in the more simpler models for the 2-lane rurals, multi-lane rurals, urban, suburban. The other thing I want to suggest, the original Highway Safety Manual was published in 2010. And in the initial publication, the facility types where we could do these predictive methods were specifically 2-lane rural, multi-lane rural, urban, suburban. Subsequent to that, in 2014, the freeways, ramps, ramp junctions 17-45 NCHRP study was published and then adopted by the HSM as addendum or a new volume. So there initially were 3 volumes. There are now 4 volumes that include freeways, ramps, or ramp junctions. And it is comparatively a more complex procedure that involves more data elements to do the analysis when compared to the other non-full access control facility type analyses. So I just want to manage expectations as it relates to, I'm kind of condensing the content into these 3-hour bite-sized presentations, while at the same time, I want to encourage you, if this is something you would be interested in having a more fully developed and intense workshop, that's something at the end of these 3 sessions, we will be seeking some information from you as a audience to see, is there value in having an in-person comprehensive review of these procedures where we go through and apply them to case studies and actually walk through in over 2 or 3 days, full days in person, the application of these concepts. So I hope that kind of captures. I'm going to do the best I can to deliver the message, but I'm not going to be able to get into the weeds with every aspect just based on time and the content that we have delivered here. So as a part of this, there's 3 parts to the presentation. Today, we're going to do the intro and background. Tomorrow, we're going to do ISAT-E, which is the HSM methodologies applied to freeways, ramps, ramp junctions using the interchange safety analysis tool, which is an Excel spreadsheet that basically applies the NCHRP 1745 methodology. And then next Friday, Derek Troyer, a member on my team within the safety and design technical service team, is going to be here to walk us through the interactive highway safety design model. All right, that's me. Pardon me. I've been with Fed Highway for 22 years. And prior to that, as Taylor mentioned, I also worked in academia and in consulting. I find that DDSA really is an area of particular interest to me. I consider myself about half a statistician, half an engineer, so I'm dangerous in both fields. But I find that the importance of using data and analytics to set policy in an effort to control for both intended and unintended consequences is critical. And especially in the climate we're working in today. Politically, it is a very unforgiving workspace. So we want to be sure, both from the perspective of saving as many lives as humanly possible, but also being able to defend investment decisions we make. Because anytime you're dealing with spending public money, you will be placed under scrutiny in terms of how that money did we achieve a return on that investment? And it's not unless you deploy data-driven safety and analytical tools that we get a full picture of how we received a return on that investment. Okay. And then how do we deal? Typically in an in-person session, just open it up for discussion. You can stop me at any time. In this format, at least initially, we're going to just have you type questions into the chat pod, and every so often I will go in and check those to see if I can answer them. If not, I will follow up, and over the next 2 sessions, if I get a question today I can't answer, I'll likely come back tomorrow morning and follow up with that. If after next Friday a question comes in that we haven't answered, I will make sure to follow up through Taylor and email any question or answers to those questions that we find after the fact. Let me also suggest this. In November of 1985, a significant event occurred. The release of version 1.0 of Windows occurred back in November of 1985, and it had a major shift in the impact it had on people's ability to use computers. Now, that first version wasn't an operating system, but it was more of like a file share app before the apps that existed, and as we currently know them. But it then evolved into a full operating system where everything is point and click. I view that change in November of 1985 and the impact that's had on the computational world to what we're dealing with in the safety community, specifically related to the release of the Highway Safety Manual in 2010. Namely, it changed the game with respect to how do we analyze and deal with safety as it relates to our project development process, because we can now quantify expected safety benefits in terms of crashes reduced by type and severity for our projects. In managing expectations with respect to this tool, the one thing I want to suggest to you, we are a version 1.0 of the Highway Safety Manual. The second edition is planned to be released within the next year and a half or so. And the analogy I'm making, going back to the Windows in 1985, if I were to compare today's, we're at Windows 10 or 11, to that first version of Windows, you would say these are two entirely different tools. I would say the same thing about the Highway Safety Manual. A generation from now, I wouldn't even say a generation, I'll say 5 to 10 years from now, when we get to the second, third, and fourth edition of this manual, my expectation is it is going to evolve and become more accurate, as well as more precise in our ability to quantify the interrelationships that exist between crash risk and design element. So the tool is not perfect, but today it's the best form of a model that we have to explain the variability of crashes as a function of traffic volume and geometric design element. Let me pause for a second. I see there's a question. Please turn on closed captions. I cannot hear the presenter. All right, Taylor, can you turn on the closed captions? I'm not sure if my volume's not coming through on everyone's computer. If it's not, just holler. Okay, so now let me also suggest the HSM, ISAT-E, IHSDM are tools that are based heavily on statistics. And these by themselves are not safety analyzers, but rather we as engineers need to be aware of the strengths as well as the limitations of these tools and the statistics behind how the tools are predicting crashes and what the implications are of any assumptions that exist, as well as the application of these tools. I would consider this workshop a success if I don't just inform you of what the tools can do, but rather what they are, what the limitations of these tools are specifically. And what I mean by that is, I'm going to give you a variety of approaches that you could deploy to do data-driven safety analysis for a project. And in your mind, you might think, oh, that's great. I've got 5 or 6 different choices. Which one should I choose? Oftentimes, it's not you making the choice when you go into a project. The context of that project will likely dictate which approach for analysis is applicable for that project. And that element requires some engineering judgment. And one of the most challenging things is this question of how do I deploy engineering judgment when I'm dealing with a tool that is brand new, right? We have no history or track record of deploying this tool. So how do I rely on my engineering experience and judgment when applying a brand new tool? And this is something where I've been dealing for the last 10 years in delivering workshops and providing technical support for the use of the Highway Safety Manual, that I encourage. There's more than one right answer to these questions. There are very few absolutes. And what's key is documentation and consideration of the different approaches to make sure that we're deploying the one that's most appropriate. Much like the Highway Capacity Manual, There will be sites that you try and evaluate the operational implication of design decisions where the site itself is not a one-to-one match to the facilities within the HCM and their criteria for those facilities. So how then do we deploy this tool in light of that? And it's, I mean, anytime you're dealing with any model or tool for prediction, there are contexts with which it's appropriate and judgment needs to be used in the application. And that's what I'm going to try and convey as a result of this workshop. Okay, and then one other element, the initial release for the HSM, this is a macroscopic planning tool. So when applying it to make project level decisions, there's some subtle subtleties associated with this when using it for a project-based decision-making tool, how to deploy that as well. And we'll touch on that as a part of the workshop as well. All right. Let me continue. And the estimation and models that are here are based on scientific research. And I'm going to get into that a little bit more as well. Okay, so for this workshop, what do we want to achieve? I'm going to start by looking at how we can conduct safety analysis on freeways, full access control facilities specifically, and the interchanges that are comprised within, to help make more informed investment decisions regarding safety for those projects. And then also their application on a planning level. So one other issue that I'm hesitant to bring up now, but I think it's important, is this idea of the level of effort associated with the data-driven safety analysis we conduct should be in line with the scale and scope of the project. So where I'm getting at here is if you've got $1 billion interchange project, that may warrant spending, 500 to 1,000 hours on analytics to evaluate different alternatives. If, however, you're looking at a low-cost $50,000 project where you're non-interstate and you're looking at installing rumble strips or something like that, the level of effort based on that scale and scope in terms of DDSA may not warrant. In fact, I would encourage, you probably wouldn't want to put more than a few hours into any analysis for that scale and scope. And this leads me to, I didn't have this on the list, but I do want to put it up there, the FHWA scale and scope guidelines. And I'll call that up after the first break and show you that reference. Okay, so we will look at how the Highway Safety Manual chapters on freeways and interchanges can be applied for the PDP and the predictive methodology, and apply that predictive methodology using ISAT-E as well as the IHSDM. And today we're going to talk about generally the theory behind this predictive methodology. Tomorrow we'll get into the application using the Excel spreadsheet, and then next Friday using the CAD-based interactive highway safety design model tool. The example that we typically use when delivering the workshop is shown here. It's a couple interchanges on Pennsylvania's I-70, where we reconfigure it to examine the effect of altering the current form of these interchanges and then estimating the safety effect of those changes. And here are a few pictures of that Interstate 70 in Pennsylvania. That is the focus of our the examples we will deploy. It's got accel decel lanes. It's a 2-lane in each direction freeway facility. And there are a couple different alternatives that we will explore and analyze within the context of this workshop. Okay, so today we're going to just get into the theory behind safety analysis for freeways and interchanges. Tomorrow we'll get into ISAT-E and the application of these theories using the Excel spreadsheet to that example I-70 in Pennsylvania. And next Friday we will do the same example using IHSDM and show you the when it would be appropriate to use the Excel spreadsheet versus IHSDM. And as I mentioned before, there are very few absolutes. And if you walk away from this workshop not remembering anything else, let me share with you what I say in every workshop. If you're ever in a public setting and presented with a challenging question about highway safety, the correct answer almost always is it depends. Context is critical. So you may ask, well, when should I use ISAT-E versus IHSDM? It depends on the scale, scope of the project, on your comfort level with Excel versus a CAD-based software tool, and to what extent will that learning curve, going through that learning curve, be productive in terms of use of your time and return on investment for that project. So these are the typical questions I would ask myself when presented with a project, given its context and what type of analysis I want to conduct, and then what tool would I use to conduct that analysis. And these are, generally the thought process I would go through. And then at the end of next Friday, we'll put it all together and give you a big picture and kind of get a gauge for whether or not we want to move forward. Do we want to have an in-person workshop where we get into the weeds and actually deploy this over 3 days in more detail? All right. So if there are no questions, I'm going to just jump in now to the big picture highway safety manual application towards freeways, ramps, ramp junctions. Oh, the other thing I will suggest, I realize in a virtual format, typically what I like to do is I'll speak for about 50 minutes or so and then take 10 minutes off, just so that we can, if you have to use the restroom or get another cup of coffee, we can do that. So I'll go until about 50 after the hour, and then we'll break till the top of the hour and do it again. All right. So what are we looking for when we conduct safety analysis at a freeway, interchange, or ramp junction? Well, oftentimes we're dealing with, these are big budget projects. And in evaluating the efficacy of such a project, in the past, we would typically use standards to say, okay, well, we want to bring this element within the project up to standard because our expectation is by complying with standards, it will yield an operational and safety performance that is consistent with our expectations. Well, simple compliance with standards does not ensure a level of safety performance that is acceptable. And furthermore, sometimes it's not achievable, and sometimes it's not the most cost-effective approach that we should be considering for a project. For anybody that's ever seen that movie, A Beautiful Mind, I use this analogy when trying to capture the challenges that we have when dealing with highway safety projects. One of the major challenges is we don't have enough money for all the projects worthy of funding. So we have to make difficult choices. In that movie, A Beautiful Mind, there was a researcher named John Nash from Princeton who was examining and going to grad school for a PhD, and he was studying economic theory. And as a part of his studies, he was looking at Adam Smith's economic theory about each individual doing what's best for themselves will yield what's best for the group that they're a part of. And John Nash said, well, that's incomplete. If you remember from the movie, that's the quote he used. It's each individual doing what's best for themselves, so long as that decision is also what's best for the group that that individual is a part of. So that fundamental economic theory and enhancement that Nash made, and he won a Nobel Prize for that, we are trying to deploy that within our jurisdictions project selection process, meaning each individual project, we would only do what's best for that individual project if it's also yielding the biggest return for the system that that project is a part of. So the overall transportation system in our jurisdiction is our full, I guess, suite of available investments. And we only do what's best for one individual part of that system if it is going to yield the biggest return across all the other investment opportunities within the system. So philosophically, the Highway Safety Manual provides us the ability to estimate expected impacts of design decisions on crash risk through the prediction of number of crashes per year for different designs on different projects. And using that information, we can then do exactly what Nash and John and Adam Smith were discussing here, is identify the combination of project and design that will yield the biggest reduction in fatal and injury crashes for the money we have available. And the overall goal here, we're making more informed investment decisions with considering safety explicitly within the PDP. Okay. So now how do we incorporate this safety analysis in design? And some of the questions we want to ask ourselves are, has the number and type of crashes at my project study site been quote unquote normal? Will this, and what is normal? That's, if I'm sitting where you are, that's probably the question that would immediately come to my mind is, what is normal or acceptable? And that is a sensitive issue. And many of you, if you're working and dealing in public meetings, may have come across a scenario where you get two very pointed questions. One, how many people have to die at this location? And the second, I just lost it. How many people have to die? And well, I'll come up with the second, but that question is a difficult one to answer, especially in a public setting. As an engineer, my reaction to that is no fatals are acceptable in my mind. However, I'm operating in a position where I do not have unlimited resources. So what I have to do is, in managing the money for safety projects, is identify what combination of project and design will yield the largest number of reduction in fatal and serious injury crashes within my jurisdiction. And because of this limitation, we have to make hard choices. So how do I establish or identify sites that are operating at an acceptable versus unacceptable? And I'm using that term acceptable more from a statistical side as opposed to a public relations side, because no fatal or serious injury crash or crash altogether is acceptable. But you get my point. We have to establish here some threshold value by which we filter out sites that are operating, and what's used here is quote unquote normal, versus sites that are operating at an unacceptable level of risk. And we can use data within the state as well as the models within the HSM to help us identify that idea of what is quote unquote normal. And other questions: will the proposed improvement have a significant safety benefit? Now that term significant would be the question in my mind. Well, what do you mean by significant? And in my position, how I would respond to that is that term significant refers to the fact, when comparing to all the other investment opportunities I have available to me, I'm selecting the one that has the largest or biggest return on investment. And that return is focused on reducing injury and fatal crashes. The next question: how can I evaluate a proposed design exception? This tool is, if we think about data-driven safety analysis using the Highway Safety Manual, I think the greatest opportunity for initial deployment is in the application of design exceptions, where we identify what would have happened, what is the expected safety performance if I comply with standards, and then what, for the case where we're dealing with this specific project, what is the implication of not achieving standard, but by providing the some other design dimension for a design element that is below standard, and quantify that. And then you know what it would cost to achieve standard if it is possible. And you can determine, in this case, are there other investment opportunities within my jurisdictions that I could save more lives with for that same amount of money? Or because that level or that amount of money that is needed to bring it up to standard is not within our budget, we're just trying to improve the situation to a condition that's better than it is today. And we basically would document that. So those are, that is a common initial area where the HSM and DDSA can be deployed and have a direct impact on day-to-day activities. And it doesn't require, in many cases, a heavy lift, because oftentimes we're just looking at one design element or two design elements and the impact of a design exception for those elements. And then just closing out this slide before we go to a break is adding this safety enhancement to my project worth the cost. This DDSA using HSM provides us the ability to quantify and evaluate that. Relative safety differences between alternatives, another element and question that we can answer using DDSA. And how will safety be impacted by future traffic volumes? So the one constant in our world is change. And in evaluating the performance of our system, we have to the best of our ability, incorporate future changes into our initial evaluations to make projections about what will be the performance in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. The other analogy I make about our duties, we as engineers working on highway infrastructure projects, we are, I don't like the term safety engineers. I prefer the term risk management engineers. As well as, if you were to put this on my business card, I prefer you call me a highway risk management engineer, as well as a financial advisor for the investment of public funds. My role is to, given the resources available, identify the combination of project and design that will yield the biggest return on investment. You're going to hear me say this. I've said it multiple times already this morning. I'll continue to say it, because I think that is the best way to express what it is we are trying to achieve as a result of the use of DDSA within our projects. And in doing so, to the best of our ability, we are not day traders as financial advisors. We are bond investors, more akin to bond investors, because our projects have lives of 20 to 30 years. And sometimes this comes in conflict with the political element that exists within any organization, because in some cases your elected officials have 2 or 4 year windows where they want to see returns immediately because it directly impacts their position. And this is where there could be some scenarios where, you know, me as a bond investor, if I'm in the same group as a day trader, we may have differing opinions about what is the most appropriate investment. And this is where documentation is critical. Sometimes these decisions are made above our pay grade. And that's where we can use documentation to not just protect ourselves, but also make recommendations so that as it goes up that chain of command, they get to realize the big picture of the long-term nature of the investments that we're making. So I'll pause here. I'll check to see if there's any questions before we take our first break. I don't see any. So let's, I'll stop sharing for a moment. Let's take 10 minutes. It's 5 till the hour. We'll start back up at 5 after the hour. Fine. Okay, welcome back. I did find this research report that I wanted to share and talked about earlier. And this is the, it depends on, as it relates to what type of data-driven safety analysis or safety assessment method should I deploy for my project. And fortunately, we do not have to reinvent the wheel here. This research report goes through and examines the different approaches that are available to us, as well as provides examples of each of these approaches and criteria for when and where you would deploy one approach versus another. And typically the criteria is based on the scale and scope of the project. So I encourage you to, as you start to dip your toe in the water of highway safety analysis and start to learn these different procedures, if they're new to you, you leverage all the information that's out there. You do not have to feel like that you're reinventing or starting from scratch to build or apply these models. In fact, there has been about 10 to 15 years worth of work that's been done to help ease with that transition into the use of DDSA within our projects. And as you can see within the table of contents here, it provides specific analytical approaches as well as their application to projects across different facility types, and provide some guidance on the when and where of using one safety assessment method versus another. All right. And again, that reference report is the scale and scope of safety assessment methods in the PDP, or project development process. All right, let me get back to the script for a moment here. So that is directly linked to this question that I wanted to pose. And if you could in the chat pod, just take a moment and answer, what methods or tools do you currently use to analyze safety on a freeway or interchange improvement project, or if that's outside your scope, any non-freeway facility as well? So what current methodologies are you deploying? And especially if there are any data-driven analytical approaches, what tools or techniques have you delivered? And I'll just segue for a moment to the chat pod to see if you could type in your answer and read off a few, as I wanted to get a feel for, in fact, if you do own the Highway Safety Manual, also acknowledge that in the chat pod. If you don't have a copy of it, I would hope that the references that I share, and you'll get the email with that reference list, that will also assist you with that. But if you have any experiences, again, please share what techniques you're currently using for safety analysis, if any. I'm not seeing any comments in there, and I'll leave the chat pod open as I continue. But my expectation is that Florida, like many other states, there's some variability that exists throughout the country in the deployment of DDSA. Some states have taken a more active role. Others have kind of taken a wait and see approach with it. Wherever you are with respect to your jurisdiction is, I think, an area of opportunity to both deploy and improve upon the current protocol for incorporating DDSA within our projects, and specifically PDP. Let's see, there's a hand raised. Let me check. No, okay. Thanks, Gary. And Taylor, you had a question?
I was just going to acknowledge that you did receive a response to your discussion question in the chat or in the Q&A panel, that there's no not currently being used the HSN manual just yet.
Yeah, thank you, Taylor. And that is a that's okay. In fact, when I initially started selling the HSM, and when I say sell, I feel like I'm a bit of a traveling salesperson. I go around the country identifying what it can do, what it can't do, when it's appropriate for use. And one of the key elements here, if you think about what's occurring within the HSM, as we'll see in the next slide or two, is this idea that we have a national model predicting safety performance for different facility types. Now, in many states, they have their own state design manual. It's my expectation that the highway safety manual is going to follow suit in this way. These state design manuals basically allow states to adapt design criteria to reflect the local conditions within their state that are relevant. So in many cases, what you'll see is the state says, okay, we're going to follow the AASHTO Green Book guidelines, except for these scenarios. And for instance, a good example is super elevation. You know, if I'm in Hawaii versus Alaska, the super elevation criteria should differ, right? There's no ice or snow in Hawaii that there is in Alaska. So I could see going up to a super elevation allowable of 0.12, whereas in Alaska, it might be 0.04 max super. And this is the type of example that is relevant as well within safety prediction models. These models need to be owned locally and adapted locally to reflect what's going on locally with respect to the interrelationship that exists between driver, vehicle, and roadway. And within that, I think these models need to be fluid, adaptable, and every so often validated to make sure they reflect the current relationship between crash risk and the driver vehicle roadway environment. Now, this then leads me to some of the issues that currently exist within the highway safety manual. From the prediction side, what it predicts is crashes per year. So it's a macroscopic tool, and it uses a variety of traffic volume or ADT, segment length, so exposure elements, along with geometric design elements, lane width, shoulder width, grade, interchange access, dimensions, and so on and so forth. And the models themselves are fluid as they're trying to estimate something that's constantly changing. And that constantly changing element are basically the infrastructure, the traffic volumes per year, and then the relative risk associated with crashes for different combinations of geometry, traffic volume at different locations, because drivers in South Florida versus Northern California, there are certain inherent behavioral differences that we try to adapt models to reflect. So this is why I think that there's an opportunity here for states and locals to adapt the overall highway safety manual methodologies by incorporating and adjusting these models to reflect what's going on locally. So generally speaking here, and getting back to the script on the slide, what the HSM is promoting is it provides a tool where we are able to integrate safety into the decision-making process explicitly. Whereas in the past, we would incorporate safety often by examining the project and design elements within a project to see, do they comply with standards? Whereas today, we're able to quantify the expected risk of crashes occurring for given designs using these models. And that's where this quote comes from. This roadway safety management is in transition, which the transition is based on experience, intuition, and judgment, and tradition, which is compliance with standards, to a new area or focus, which is based on empirical evidence, science, and technology. It's not to say we are going to remove engineering experience and intuition from the equation, but rather complement that with data-driven analytical tools that predict safety, that allow us to separate the gray area and obtain objective predictions to differentiate the difference between two designs within a project or two specific projects that are both available for funding. Okay, so, and the primary element within the HSM that we're focused on as a part of this workshop are the predictive methods. Let me suggest there are 4 parts to the manual. Part A is the introduction, background, kind of what I did thus far. I showed you some of the track record of crash history over the last 40 years in this country. I also shared with you the idea that this traffic crash problem is predominantly when trying to explain variability in crashes, the human element comes into play. And these models don't explicitly capture the human element as predictors, but rather use the geometrics and traffic as predictors to explain variability in crashes. And the parts B of the HSM get into the HSIP process. So how to do a network screening and identify the sites that have the greatest potential for safety improvement. Part C incorporate these predictive methods. And then part D are the crash modification factors that we can apply in combination with the predictive methods to assess expected predicted performance for a project or a set of projects to identify which has the greatest potential for safety improvement. The goal here is to give safety a voice in the same way that we have models to predict environmental impacts. The highway capacity manual is used to predict traffic operations impacts, and we have simulation tools for operational performance. We have models for pavement life and construction cost. What was lacking were models that quantify safety effects, and these data-driven safety analytical tools do just that. It, in my mind, gives safety a voice so that we now can incorporate safety explicitly into the PDP by setting it up as one of the stakeholder values and quantifying the benefit and cost associated with remedies that are focused on reducing the number of crashes by severity on a facility. Okay, I kind of let this cat out of the bag with respect to this question earlier when I said, that we in the past have focused on does our design comply with standards, and that was our primary safety check. And as I hope you would all react when seeing this question here, my design meets or exceeds all minimum design criteria, therefore it's safe. And I would hope you would all say, well, that statement is false. Simple compliance with standards does not ensure an acceptable level of safety performance. And in such, it is a key component to this process. In fact, what we label this as is nominal safety check for our projects. And I would expect that for every project you work on, we would deploy an examination of the project design elements to see, are they in compliance with standards? If they are not, that does not necessarily mean that we need to bring this project to the top of the list by itself to recommend compliance with standards. But because we have limited resources, we would want to examine, is there a substantive safety deficiency at these sites that are resulting because of the fact that we are not in compliance with standards. So these are the types of questions that this becomes a little more complex than this binary world. Do we comply with standards or not? In fact, the world we work in now is a little more complex because in as much as compliance with standards is key, we also need to use data to identify the locations that will yield the biggest return on our investment. And that's what this slide is kind of capturing, this world where we have two different analytical elements. We have the analytical side where we're examining the project design elements from the perspective of, are we complying with standards? And then on the other side, we're examining the historical performance of this project, if it's an existing project or existing site, in terms of the actual crash performance or predicted crash performance for a site with these conditions. Now, this world of nominal versus substantive safety is something that I think is a temporary phenomenon. And what I mean by that is it's my expectation as our models that quantify the relationship between design element and crash risk improve, what you're going to see is these two concepts being combined together when we establish and set performance-based design standards. And what you'll see in the most recent edition of the in the AASHTO Green Book is a rewrite of Chapter 1 in the 7th edition, where they incorporate this idea of performance-based standards being developed from data-driven analytical tools like the Highway Capacity Manual and the Highway Safety Manual that will be used for certain contexts to dictate what the optimal combination of design elements would be to yield the most efficient outcome for that project. And this slide I could spend an hour just discussing because this captures data-driven safety analysis to a T. On the left, the visual reflects a world in which nominal safety is dictating, where the x-axis represents the design dimension for a design element. That design element could be lane width, horizontal curve radius, stopping sight distance, and so on and so forth. And what you see here on the y-axis is crash risk. And where you see the step down function on the left is located at the point where the design element is at its standard value. So the design dimension for that design element is compliant with standards. The implication there is, as you can see with my arrow, we are at a level of risk that is reflected at this step. Now, if we went 1 unit below that design dimension, so instead of 12-foot lane widths, I'm at 11.9 foot. Implicit in this image is the assumption that I would inflate crash risk by going even slightly below the design standard to that level of the step. That does not accurately reflect reality. In fact, what we've seen through DDSA is the development of models that quantify this substantive safety relationship between the design dimension for a design element and crash risk. So when you look at it, for instance, for lane width, if I were looking at 11.9 versus 12-foot lane width, you could see the relative difference in crash risk for those two scenarios would be very slight. I'm not sure if there are any attorneys here, but in this world, the stepwise function, the binary world of did you comply with standards or not, I can see that being more in line with what an attorney would ask in terms of a question. Did you comply with standard or not? With the implication that by not complying with standards, it yielded the unfortunate result that may have occurred as a result of a traffic crash. Whereas when we deal with substantive safety, if we look at the relative difference in risk between a 12-foot versus 11.5-foot lane width, or a 200, or let me say a 300-foot versus 325-foot horizontal curve radius, that relative risk difference is what's being analyzed and used to make judgments about, we know the cost of these features, but is it cost beneficial given the return on that investment in terms of reduced crashes when we can potentially invest that amount of money somewhere else? Do we get a bigger return on investment? And this is philosophically, given the fact that we have limited resources, the only way we will be able to achieve the optimal results is through a data-driven analytical approach, evaluating the different combinations of designs within a project and then different projects that we have available for funding, that optimization of the project selection given the resources available on an annual basis. And I really want to impress upon you in this slide on the right-hand side, what's occurred over the past 25 to 30 years has been for each design element, establishing and quantifying the mathematical model that evaluates and predicts crash risk as a function of changing the design element for that design, or excuse me, the design dimension for that design element. Okay, and another caveat that we promote here is the second you open up a roadway to the public, we are in a partnership. So what we put out there in terms of the physical designs and roadway attributes that are in the right of way, we are now in a partnership with the users. And this is going back to the safe system approach, the idea of redundancy within the system and that we have to share responsibility. We cannot do this alone, meaning we cannot get to 0 fatals, 0 injuries a year unless we are in partnership and we see that the roadway users are responsible for their behavior. There also, when we look at the roadway infrastructure, there is no such thing as absolute safety. In fact, I usually start these workshops off by saying, I don't even like the term safe. And on my business card, it says senior safety engineer. I would strike that out. I mentioned before, I prefer you call me a risk management engineer. Why? If you look up safe in a dictionary, one of the definitions, free of risk from harm. Well, anytime we open up a roadway to the public, there's risk. We go out and drive on a section of roadway, there's risk. We walk as a pedestrian adjacent to that roadway, there's risk. And what's important is to be fully transparent about that risk. I'll share a little story about there was a crash on the metro here in DC area. This is about 10, 12 years ago. And as a result of this crash on the metro, there was about 50 injuries and a handful of people died. And the next day on News Talk Radio here in DC, the head of engineering for the metro got on to talk about that crash. And the interviewer asked the head of engineering for the metro, is it safe to ride the metro? So, and this was this was the second question I mentioned before when I said, how many people have to die? And is it safe for this? When I heard that question about the train, and is it safe to ride the metro in DC? My first reaction was, that is bait. That question, there's no right answer. And let me share why. First and foremost, you're not going to say, no, it's not safe, because then you're out of a job. But secondly, even saying, yes, it's safe, what does that imply? That you're free of risk from harm? So I think if I were responding to this question now, at the time, I had thought about it for a couple hours after the question was stated on the radio, because I was thinking, how would I have answered that question? Because it's a pointed and it's a challenging question, that it's a legitimate question too. People are concerned. So my response to that question to the interviewer would have been, well, define safe. Because each individual, if I asked everybody in this workshop to write down their definition of safe, it's likely there will be subtle differences between each individual's definition based on your previous experiences. And I take it a step further and I'd say, I think that question is not relevant to your broader listening audience, but it's only relevant to you because in your mind, you have a set of criteria by which you say, is something safe? And for you, that criteria might be, there's no risk of any crash ever occurring on this facility. Well, in a perfect world, we would hope to be able to say something like that, but it's not practical in the world we live in. So I think a more relevant question is, to what extent is there risk in doing, in this case, riding the metro, but for our purposes more broadly, in getting from point A to point B by the variety of modes available to us? What is the risk? And then what we want to do is communicate that to the public, be fully transparent. Here's what the risk is associated with traveling by different modes from point A to point B. And then we would also want to, and if I were responding to that question again, that was posed to the director of engineering for Metro, I'd also say, well, I'd want to do a comparison of, well, how are other cities' metro systems performing? And what is the level of risk associated with traveling in those other jurisdictions? Because we need some baseline by which we evaluate the performance. And that's kind of the risk assessment where we have, and I don't like using the term an acceptable level of risk, but an average, I'll use the term average performance, so that we see which facilities, or for our purposes, roadways, are operating above that and which are operating better than that. And what we'll do is focus our investments and projects on the sites that are performing above. And when I say above, you're having a greater crash risk on these facilities when compared to other facilities within our jurisdiction. By treating those and bringing them down to the average, you thereby, in the long term, move the average lower. So it's kind of like the reverse philosophy of the financial sector, where on Wall Street, they're looking for higher highs and higher lows, all else being equal. From highway safety perspective, what we're trying to do is achieve lower highs and lower lows through through our each year's program, systematically focused on treating the sites that have the greatest potential for safety improvement. Coming back to this slide, that kind of throws out this idea of there's a world of absolute safety, but rather this is a continuum. And what we want to do is focus on treating the sites with the greatest potential for safety improvement and move them and their performance down to the acceptable level of risk, which I identified as the average level. And by doing so, the average, all else being equal, will constantly move lower. And philosophically, this risk-based approach, I think, is a healthier way to deal with those pointed questions about, is this safe? And additionally, those pointed questions about responding to, well, an individual, or there's a tragic event at a location, and why wasn't that considered for treatment prior to this event occurring? And bringing in the big picture of, we have probably 100 sites, all worthy of funding, but we don't have resources to address the issues that exist with all these sites. So we do the best we can by prioritizing them to save as many lives and injuries as possible, given the available resources for our jurisdiction. And that's our focus here, reducing the risk of crashes and severity. Probably preaching to the choir here with you all, and I'm pretty sure you're all aware of this, but a good design is more than just looking up from design standards the values in a reference, but rather it's deploying engineering knowledge and an understanding of the relationships that exist between our design elements and the crash risk associated with them. We are in the business of managing risk and maximizing return on investment. Hence that analogy I made. We are risk management engineers and financial advisors for the investment of public funds. And what I foresee is, in future editions of the Green Book, as well as state design standards, is the adoption of performance-based standards which merge both substantive and nominal safety together. So you have one continuum there that reflects optimal scenarios for the context of your project. And sometimes it may not be feasible to achieve the highest level of performance standard for a project, given some site constraints or limitations in resources. So at that point, then we have to optimize the project given the context of that project, which includes resources that are available, right away that's available, so on and so forth. So this, I can see this becoming, for each unique project, there will be a specific optimal performance design available to us given the constraints of that project. So what I mean by that is you may see a day where each project has its own unique performance-based standard based on the context of that project. Philosophically, that's where I see this road leading us towards. The issue here is we are at version 1.0 of the safety manual, which at this point doesn't allow for the level of nuance that's necessary to achieve what I just described. But that's the path we're heading down by improving and building and expanding these models. Okay, so here's another question. A safety analysis is a table summarizing the safety data or the crash data from the past few years. So this, as a true and false question, I say this is one form of safety analysis, includes an examination of crash history data for your site, but it's not all inclusive. This may be one key component to our safety analysis, and it provides insights of the substantive safety record for a project. But as you'll find out as we deploy these procedures over the next tomorrow and next week, that there's a little more to it than just looking at historical data to make decisions about future path. We use these data in combination with models to make projections about what will occur into the future for this project if we do nothing versus if we make some design changes to that site. Now, in the Highway Safety Manual, they use 3 terms for crashes. The first is observed, and what you see here is a good example of the observed crash history for a project. The second is predicted. Predicted crashes are those crashes, or the number of crashes that the Highway Safety Manual or some other analytical tool that predicts crashes yields for our project. Now, in the Highway Safety Manual, if you combine predicted with the observed using a weighted structure called empirical Bayes, we can end up with an expected number of crashes that accounts for regression to the mean effects, or the idea that crashes are random in nature, random events, and you will see year over year fluctuations that exist. So the use of observed crash history data in combination with Highway Safety Manual or state-specific crash prediction models allow us, using those 2 tools together, to make more informed decisions about the performance of this facility and how is it operating, either acceptable or unacceptable level of risk, as well as what any geometric or treatment changes that we would make to the site and the impact they would have on future performance. So the other way these predicted values can be used is also as a reference point. So let's say, for instance, you're not sure about statewide average for an interstate section on our infrastructure, how well it's performing. Well, you have the observed crash history. You could use the model predicted values as a reference point, because that's telling you what the average site performed at that exists, that had this level of traffic volume, these geometric conditions, and these treatments on site. So that predicted value provides you a reference point by which you can examine the operational performance, meaning the observed crash history, to that predicted value to see, is it more, less than, or right on what we would expect this site to perform at. Let me pause here. I see a question. Arturo, that's an interesting question. There's a human element to this. Arturo's question is, how and what is the opportunity that exists for improving driver performance through driver training to reduce risk? And I would argue or respond to that in this way. So initially, when I started off with the safe system approach, I mentioned this shared responsibility. And our sister agency, NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, is focused on in-vehicle technology and driver behavior. We at Fed Highway are focused on the infrastructure. So yes, there is an opportunity that when we train our drivers, especially young drivers, and prepare them for what's out there better, it will also contribute to making this, and through this shared responsibility safe system approach, it'll contribute to us getting to that zero goal of zero fatal, zero injuries. Great point, Arturo. But coming back for our purposes, what we're trying to do is identify combinations of the roadway infrastructure elements that are consistent with optimal performance from the perspective of highway safety, or basically minimizing crash risk. So it's when I was first taught, my first class on geometric design of roadways was in the late 80s. And I remember the first concept that was delivered was this idea of design consistency. And what is design consistency? That is basically having a roadway design that is in compliance with user expectations. So we want our roadways to be designed in such a way that they are in line with what the drivers are expecting. And by doing so, you'll have harmony between the user and the roadway performance output. So one way we measure to what extent are we achieving design consistency or meeting or being compliant with user expectation are operational and safety performance metrics. So we look at speed changes between successive design elements. If we start to see large speed changes of greater than 10 miles an hour, it's an indicator that this combination of design elements may be inconsistent or violating driver expectancy. Similarly, you start to see areas where you have clusters of crashes, or in examination crash data that involve injury or fatal crashes, you start to explore, well, what common elements exist in the roadway infrastructure at these sites where these injury and fatal crashes were occurring. And by examining and using the data, we can then prioritize, hey, let's, when we see horizontal curves after very long approach tangents that are less than 500-foot radii, we'll want to provide added traffic control devices to alert drivers that this curve is going to influence and require them to adjust their operating speeds to be able to safely maneuver through that horizontal alignment. So these are the ideas and metrics that are leveraging data to help make and change policy related to our design elements. Okay, so bringing this a little bit further now into a practical application, in the scenario where our observed crash history is worse than what we would expect, now we need to deploy our engineering analysis. What are the factors in the right-of-way within our design that may be the contributory factors relating to that over representation of crashes at this location? And with that in mind, we focus on how to mitigate or address that difference between observed performance and what we would expect a site with this, with these attributes to perform at. And then once we have gotten to that, point, this is where the Adam Smith John Nash, beautiful mind, economic theory comes into play. Because we have a variety of investment opportunities within our jurisdiction at the 100 or so, I'm making up that number, potential safety projects each year, what we want to do then is evaluate each of these and quantify the benefit cost associated with each of these projects. And in doing so, we then identify the combination of project and design that will yield the biggest reduction in fatal and injury crashes within our jurisdiction. And we do this systematically year over year. It is the optimal approach to saving the most lives and injuries given the resources available to us. So we use this economic appraisal tool as a part of our project selection process, our PDP project development process, and then also our final design procedures. And here's an example of some different alternatives for a project. So as an economic evaluation tool to assess the safety benefit in an economic analysis, what we want to do typically is convert the change in operations into a present value benefit, convert the change in crashes into a present value benefit. We construct or calculate the construction costs, and then obtain a net present value for our costs that is then used to establish or calculate a benefit cost ratio. So for this example here, you see a variety of different alternatives, A through D, that show the present value of the benefits, the present value of the costs, the net present value for the project, and the benefit cost ratio. So now it may be a pointed question of, well, which of these different alternatives would we identify as our preferred alternative? And the answer to that is it depends. If the criteria here is net present value, you can see then it would be alternative B. If the criteria that we want to use is BC ratio, then it would probably be alternative A. But it's a data-driven procedure by which we are selecting the alternative of interest for our specific project. And then if we get for each project, we've identified the preferred alternative, then we can compare that preferred alternative by project level to identify the combination of project and design that yields the biggest return on our investment. Okay, so now applying this. So as a tool to assess the design options, we look at the different interchange configuration alternatives, ramp and ramp terminal alternatives. We can look at effects of increasing or decreasing weaving distances, the effects of design exceptions, the impacts of a proposed development. And if we're proposing a new interchange at a location, we can quantify the expected impact of that new interchange on increased crashes and offset or mitigate for those increases through design elements and design attributes to the project, while also considering the potential benefits from that interchange, that new interchange, in the form of economic opportunities that are created from that new interchange. So John Cheney is asking, does the economic evaluation include economic value of life analysis? Yes, John, that's a great question. So, and it leads me, after we take the next break, there is another reference that we use that is the benefit cost analysis for highway safety projects that I will pull up. But you're exactly right. As a part of this analytical procedures I'm proposing here, what we are doing is predicting crashes. Now, initially they are total crashes, but now we have probability distributions of crashes by severity, and we have crash cost by severity as well that are used when coming up with the benefits associated with crashes for a given design that we're dealing with. So we're seeing crashes reduced, and we basically then take those crashes that are reduced and break them down by severity and assign a value to those severities. So yes, a key component to this economic analysis are crash costs. Now, and they may differ geographically across the country based on location, as too do construction costs vary. So constructing a mile of highway in Manhattan versus Montana are likely going to yield different costs. So the crash costs and the construction costs need to be accordingly reflective of the local jurisdiction and values associated with that. There are guidelines, and I'll pull that report up after the next break and share with you the crash cost histories for the purpose of doing this type of highway infrastructure project safety evaluation. It's a great question. So what these tools allow us to do is, for example, for the variety of design options that are shown here, is quantify the safety implications of those different designs and quantify the benefit or cost associated with these different designs to bring them back to a common metric, which is BC ratio or net present value of the benefits, so that we can then make the difficult choice of identifying which projects will be funded versus those that are going to be put off until some future year because they do not yield a the highest level of return on investment that we're using as our criteria. Okay, so now I'm going to jump into the crash prediction methodologies. I've done a lot of broad discussion over the topics. As I mentioned before, the initial release had 3 facility types: 2-lane rural, multi-lane rural, urban, suburban. And in 2014, the supplement that we're going to be covering as a part of this workshop on freeways, ramps, ramp junctions was published. The general model form is shown here for all models across the different facility types shown. Is what we're doing here is predicting the number of crashes as a function of 3 elements. The first being a safety performance function. The second are CMFs, or crash modification factors, that are linked to design elements. And then the third is a calibration factor, which adjusts this national model to reflect any differences that are occurring locally in terms of its performance. Now, let's start with the safety performance functions. These safety performance functions are nonlinear regression models typically that are predicting crashes based on exposure. So AADT is a common predictor, and for segments, segment length is another exposure element that's used to predict the number of crashes per year by these safety performance functions. And they were developed for a number of similar sites for a given set of specific base conditions. And typically the predictor variable for an SPF is ADT, and for segments, segment length. For intersections, it's ADT for the major and minor approach. So you have 2 ADT as the predictor, 2 ADT values as the predictor variables. And then what's done as it relates to these safety performance functions, it's similar to how the Highway Capacity Manual addresses this idea of quantifying the operational implications of design decisions. The theoretical basis for the Highway Capacity Manual procedures, for instance, for a freeway facility, is that there's a theoretical throughput for any freeway facility. In fact, that's like 2,400 passenger cars per hour per lane. So that theoretical throughput then is adjusted to reflect the existing conditions for our site using factors. So you have like a heavy vehicle factor, commuter factor, interchange factor for the capacity of a freeway facility. And what we end up doing is adjusting that theoretical capacity of 2,400 passenger cars per hour per lane using these different factors, heavy vehicles, so on and so forth. And you may end up with a actual capacity of 2,000 vehicles per hour per lane for that facility. And then we compare the actual volume to that capacity. You get your VOC ratio, and it's linked to some level of service. So the Highway Safety Manual does something similar. In estimating whatever that theoretical capacity is that the capacity manual uses, in the safety manual, what we're doing is, given a certain level of exposure for a set of base conditions, we would expect a certain number of crashes. So for instance, for a 2-lane rural highway, if I have a 10-mile section of 2-lane rural highway with 10,000 vehicles per day, I would expect on average about 26.7 crashes per year, given that combination of exposure. 10 miles with 10,000 vehicles per day on a 2-lane rural highway. That is linked to a set of base conditions. Those base conditions include 12-foot lane width, 6-foot paved shoulders, flat terrain, no horizontal curves, no lighting, and so on and so forth. So what we end up doing is we use the safety performance function to basically quantify, in the same way the capacity manual establishes that theoretical throughput of a travel lane for a facility type, we are establishing, given a certain level of exposure, just that presence of vehicles operating under a set of base conditions will yield a certain number of crashes on average. And now we use the safety performance function to predict that average, and we use the subsequent CMFs to account for the prevailing conditions on site, and those attributes adjust the SPF predicted crashes to reflect the conditions that are different than the base conditions. So if we don't have a 12-foot lane width for our facility, we have an 11-foot lane width, the CMF for lane width will adjust that SPF predicted up a little bit to account for the fact that our lane width is 11 feet and not 12 feet. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so John, great question. For our application here, for freeways and full access control facilities, there are no bikes and pedestrians allowed. So this does not account for pedestrian or bike crashes. For non-freeway facilities, there are models that estimate bike and pedestrian crash predictions. Now, if we look at the history of these models, this first generation, they did the best they could. They used default probability distributions in most cases to predict pedestrian and bike crashes. The second edition of the Highway Safety Manual is going to have a more progressive analytical approach to deal with ped and bike facilities. So I want to put a pin in that question and come back to it, John. It's an important question. In the context of freeways, ramps, ramp junctions, it's not an issue because we do not allow pedestrian or bikes on our freeway facilities. But for non-freeway facilities, it is an issue. It has been a part of the initial release of the HSM 1.0, but the performance of those models is very limited. And the second edition is really going to improve upon what the models in the first edition produced. So great question. I hate to punt it, but it is something that is in relevance to this workshop. It's a bit outside the scope because we're not going to be analyzing ped and bike crashes here, except for at the ramp terminals, and I'll touch on that a little bit. But I will also suggest that the first edition of the HSM, one of the areas of opportunity for improvement are ped and bike crash predictions. Okay, we are at the top of the hour. I'm going to take another quick 10-minute break here. We'll start at 10 after 11, and I'll conclude this first session by getting through the remainder of the introductory material. Before we do break, let me stop sharing for a minute and see if there's any other questions in the chat pod. If not, we will stop here for 10 minutes and pick back up at 11:10. All right, we'll see you in 10 minutes. So, in coming back here, what I want to do first is share with you the reference I was speaking about before we took that break. So this is a highway safety benefit cost analysis tool reference guide. And all I did was Google FHWA highway safety benefit cost analysis. And it brought me right to this reference. It's also available if you go on our this roadway safety data program website. You can also access this resource through this site here. It's under the different tools that exist. So there's more than one way to get it. I just Google typically the title of the report to get to it. And what you'll find within this reference, much like that scale and scope guide, it's a tool, a reference tool written for practitioners, shows you with examples how to conduct benefit cost analysis. And it provides you some examples of crash cost by crash severity level. And that's what I wanted to segue to in a moment here, just to get you an illustrative example of how it presents those costs. So if you just bear with me, in this report, it gives me a table showing crash cost by, I'm looking for, okay. Oh, and we have this highway safety benefit cost analysis model as well. I want to make sure I got so that's for the actual analysis tool. And here is from our RSDP under tools is the highway safety benefit cost analysis guide. And the tool itself, the software tool, you can also download from this site. And this crash cost for highway safety analysis, this was the reference that provides the list of crash costs by crash severities. And it's in the table of contents. You can see the breakdown of the table of contents. There's synthesis of practice, and then it goes through and shows you certain examples of that. And if I go just briefly, let me get to that table. There's an example. In 2016 dollars nationally, this is using the CABCO scale, the unit costs per crash by severity. And then you can update that to reflect changes due to inflation. Each year, these are updated, these values. So NHTSA did the initial study, I think in 1994, that each year gets updated to reflect the impact of inflation on those values. So I encourage you, if that's an area that you're considering, is under the roadway safety data program tools, you'll see both the crash benefit cost analysis guide, the analysis tool, and the crash costs for highway safety analysis reference material that can help you through this process. And they also show examples of how to deploy this process. Okay. Just coming back to the script again, where we left off was a discussion on those safety performance functions. The way we develop a safety performance function is through the collection of data, both traffic volume and crash performance. And typically the crashes are in crashes per year. It's in the initial version, these are total crashes, but what you're starting to see now, as the research starts to mature and we get more and more data and the quality of that data improves, we're starting to see more and more SPFs broken down by crash type, crash severity, for each facility type. So we're able to now instead of predicting total crashes, we start to see models that predict uh, PDO versus fatal and injury crashes. And then we can use default distributions to break those up into the CABCO scale if we were to want to apply it to that crash cost analysis guideline criteria that I showed before. But generally what we're doing is fitting the best fit line, or in this case, it's a nonlinear function, to our crash data with our traffic volume as the predictor variable. And what you start to see is for every facility type, and then within a facility type, any other fundamental criteria that we would differentiate the facility into, for instance, area type, we would have different models to reflect that. The model form traditionally is the same as illustrated here, where, and again, I want to apologize in advance. With the publication of the Highway Safety Manual, we introduced a whole new suite of acronyms to our discipline. So I want to share with you in the context of the Highway Safety Manual, N sub SPF reflects the number of crashes predicted using the safety performance function. And here it's a function of the segment length for our freeway facility. Then you have the coefficients of the model A, B, and C, and the predictor variable is ADT. So you notice here for freeway segments, the safety performance function predictor variables are the length of the segment as well as the ADT on that segment. Now, what will also occur is, as you can see here, there are multiple SPFs shown on this figure at the bottom of the slide, broken down by first, is it a rural or an urban freeway? Secondly, how many lanes exist for that freeway? So based on the number of lanes and the area type, you will have a unique safety performance function for that. Now, this is what necessitates having a software tool, be it Excel or IHSDM, to do this, because it becomes quite cumbersome to run the analysis for these models. Now, what you also notice here is this model is predicting fatal and injury crashes. So you have, this becomes like one huge tree diagram, meaning you have SPFs for urban versus rural, based on the number of lanes of the freeway, based on what severity of crash we're predicting. And once you start to examine how many different combination of number of lanes, area type, crash type, crash severity that we're predicting for, it really increases or inflates the number of SPFs needed. So this is constantly growing. In applying this concept, you'll notice that the first breakup is it urban versus rural. The criteria for this is the population. So it uses the Green Book criteria of rural areas or areas that are boundaries outside of urban areas where the population is less than 5,000. Urban is populations greater than 5,000. I would argue that there's an it depends when it comes to area type. In fact, the most recent edition, the 7th edition of the Green Book, they incorporated into Chapter 1 the NCHRP study that expanded area type beyond the binary rural versus urban. Now, within rural, there's two groups, rural town center versus rural non-town center. And then urban, there's three categories. There's an urban core, suburban, and something in between transitionary. So now we have 5 area types as a result of the most recent NCHRP study that was adopted by the AASHTO Green Book. Now you may ask, well, what impact does that have on models that were developed prior to the release of this NCHRP study? It's a great question. At this point in time, with the current edition of the HSM, it does not reflect that new research. So we are stuck with this binary world. But the expectation with the second edition of the safety manual, they will start to examine and incorporate the nuance of those 5 categories of area type, as opposed to this 2 binary world that exists in the first edition. So, and there's some cases where it's difficult to differentiate urban from rural, especially when you're in transitionary periods or areas outskirt of urban areas. Okay. So for our freeway facilities, the SPF for the base conditions, it capture many different combinations illustrated here. So when we look at the total number of SPFs that are in the first edition of the Highway Safety Manual for freeways, ramps, and ramp junctions, you can see as it relates to this slide, there are 132 total SPFs. We have 28 for freeway segments, 18 for freeway speed change lanes, 24 for ramps, 6 for CD roads, 40 for signalized ramp terminals, and 16 for stop control ramp terminals. So this slide kind of captures the complexity of the freeway, the Highway Safety Manual as applied to freeway analysis. If we compare that to two-lane rural highways, for example, there are maybe 5 or 6 total SPFs used for two-lane rural highways. You have the segments, the intersections, and then within the intersections, there are 4 or 5 different combinations. So that's where I just show you how, and I mentioned earlier, we can get through two-lane rural, multi-lane rural, urban, suburban roadways in a day and a half. And then it takes us another day and a half to get through freeways, ramps, and ramp junctions. And sometimes even more than that, take 2 to 3 days. We do workshops on 2 to 3 days simply on freeways, ramps, and ramp junctions because of the complexity of the research involved in this facility type. Okay, so now let's examine the base conditions. So as you recall from the earlier slide, the 3 components of the predictive methods for the Highway Safety Manual, you have your the SPF predicted, we have the CMFs, and then the calibration factor. Well, we showed the SPF, and now we're going to show the base conditions that are linked to those SPF models. So these base conditions for the safety performance functions are rooted in geometric or traffic control attributes. They don't necessarily reflect a recommended feature or attribute, but rather it's a common attribute that was found when developing the models themselves. So for instance, 12-foot wide through lanes, 30-foot clear zones, permissive left turns at signalized terminals. These are examples of one of the more common attributes when dealing with these sites in the development of the models that were found and established as the base conditions. So what is a CMF? In the Highway Capacity Manual, we call these adjustment factors. And in fact, in an effort not to make this any more confusing than it has to be, I'm going to suggest to you, when you see the publication of the 2nd edition of the Highway Safety Manual, you're going to see one specific change that occurs. In Part C, the predictive methods, they are going to rename the CMFs that are associated with Part C, which are linked to the SPFs. They're going to call them adjustment factors in the 2nd edition to be consistent with what the Highway Capacity Manual uses. The reason being, because Part D of the Highway Safety Manual's 1st edition are CMFs that aren't related to the Part C CMFs. So in an effort to try and not make this any more confusing than it has to be, for the predictive methods, when they initially develop them, they develop the SPF, a link to a set of base conditions, and then for those base conditions, for the same sites, they develop CMFs for lane width, shoulder width, so on and so forth. And those CMFs, which are going to be called adjustment factors in the 2nd edition for Part C predictive methods, are different than the CMFs in Part D in the 1st edition. The CMFs in Part D were independent research studies that aren't linked to any SPF from Part C, that are based on research conducted on different treatments that we could then pull into Part C. So this is why the notation is going to be different in the 2nd edition, where the CMFs that are directly linked to the safety performance functions are going to be called adjustment factors in the second edition of the Highway Safety Manual. All right, so now let's discuss these quote unquote adjustment factors / CMFs. And I'm going to reiterate this a few times because I do want to differentiate the adjustment factors / CMFs in Part C from those CMFs in Part D that exist on the clearinghouse. But a CMF is a multiplicative factor that's used to quantify the effect of a condition that we're considering on our roadway. So if the CMF equals 1, that is linked to the base condition scenario. So for instance, a 12-foot lane width on a freeway facility has a CMF of 1.0. And what you think about when we multiply that 1.0 to this SPF predicted crashes, there's no change. The implication here is that when you comply with the base conditions, the SPF were developed under that set of base condition, and it accurately reflects a scenario where all the site's attributes are in compliance with those set of base conditions. Now, if for instance, I had the case where I didn't have a 12-foot lane, let's say I had an 11-foot lane. Well, the CMF for that scenario is going to be greater than 1. And the implication with that is that having an 11-foot lane on a freeway facility as compared to the base condition 12-foot lane is going to result in an increase in crash risk. So by multiplying a value of greater than 1.0 to the SPF predicted crashes will yield a higher number of crashes predicted for that facility. And for instance, there may be cases where I apply a treatment to the site, or I have, in the case, a wider shoulder than the base condition provides. I could end up with a CMF less than 1, which would yield a benefit, a safety benefit of having that condition that goes beyond or improves upon the base condition. So that's the idea here of these crash modification factors / adjustment factors in Part C. The value of 1 for that adjustment factor means you meet or in compliance with the base condition. Less than 1, this attribute is having a positive impact on safety. Greater than 1, it's yielding the result will be more crashes predicted when compared to the base condition. Okay, I'm looking through the questions here for a moment here. I see John Cheney mentions on our crash data dashboard website, we include the economic value for life, which may be as much as 15,800,000. And that was 2016. Yes, so these, I will also just chime in here related to crash costs. I think what the key here is consistency. So when comparing project to project or design to design, so long as you're consistent in the selection of those values, it should filter out in terms of benefit cost for comparative purposes. It should filter out and not bias the results. But it is always good to use the most up-to-date crash cost values. And then Giddy mentions, John, are there SPFs for yield-controlled ramp terminals? Interchange improvements we often see involve yield-controlled movements change to signal control. It's a good question, Giddy. The set of SPFs is not comprehensive for every possible scenario, and we will get to the conditions tomorrow that is applicable towards. Great question. Okay, so let's take a look now for freeway segments. Let's take a look at the CMFs that exist. So, and again, these are used to adjust the SPF predicted values to actual or proposed conditions that we're considering. So for the base geometric and or traffic controlled conditions, For freeways, we have 13 CMFs. For ramps, we have 9. And for crossroad and terminals, we have 11 CMFs. And then the final component to the predictive model involves calibration. A calibration factor, in my mind, in this initial edition of the Highway Safety Manual is a bit of a sledgehammer approach to adjusting the model up or down to reflect its performance. Now, what you see here is the equation to calculate that calibration factor. What's not mentioned on this slide is this is not done for a specific project, but rather what has to be conducted here is a research study where you randomly select, for instance, 30 freeway segments that have varying segment lengths from at least 1/10 of a mile up to about a mile long, somewhere in that range, where you have 30 sites randomly selected with at least 100 total crashes. And then you deploy the predictive methods for those sites. And you end up with a number of predicted crashes, and you have the observed crash history for those sites. You take the observed performance over the predicted, and for that, measure the calibration factor. And the intent here of the calibration factor is to adjust the model estimates to match local conditions. They could be climate, driver populations, animal populations, crash reporting thresholds, or crash reporting system procedures. If you deployed this methodology to calculate a calibration factor and ended up with the calibration factor equaling 1.0, you won the lottery. That means that the generic models that were developed in the initial form of the Highway Safety Manual work perfectly in your jurisdiction, and you can use them as they were developed. That's very rare. In fact, if I could just go off script for a moment here, I'm going to segue and just talk about how these models were developed. Highway Safety Information System Database. So there's a database called the HSIS database. Let me share my screen real quick because I get there. Now, for non-freeway facilities, this database was developed back in the 1990s. And what it does is it involves a sample of states, with the intent here being a representative sample, where these states had similar crash reporting thresholds. They had the ability to digitize their traffic, roadway geometrics, and crash data bases into a common database so that we could access all three components together. And from that, research studies were developed that included, for instance, the 2-lane rural highway predictive methods were based on data from these sample states that then are being deployed. Now, one of the concerns I have with data-driven safety analysis, specifically using the Highway Safety Manual, is the spatial and temporal difference between the where and when the model was developed and the data used to develop a model to the where and when the model is being applied. Meaning, for 2-lane rural highway models that were developed from these set of HSIS states, and the data that were used to develop them are from the 1990s and early 2000s, were we to apply those models in 2023 in South Florida, you start to see there's a spatial and temporal difference between the where and when the models were developed to the where and when they're being applied, which we attempt to account for through this calibration process. It is not perfect, I guess is the best way to say it. And there is sampling error that exists. Whenever we are taking samples from a population and making inferences about that population, the sampling error exists. And for that matter, I would argue that you could hypothesize that each state has its own unique set of SPFs and CMFs that reflect the inherent differences of the interrelationship between driver, vehicle, and roadway in that state. But because we are at the initial version, we are left with the overarching model developed from, in cases like this, HSIS state data that we are using to make inferences. It's not perfect, but it's the best we have today. And this calibration attempts to overcome the part of that spatial and temporal difference that I spoke of. Okay, I had touched on this a little bit before, the idea of crashes being random in events. So what that essentially means is through time, you're going to see random fluctuations in crash performance at a site. Our overarching goal is to estimate that long-term average that's shown in blue on this slide. But what we're left with in practical applications is short-term estimates of that long-term crash frequency. And those are shown in green. And depending on different 3-year or 5-year windows that we use as estimates of that long-term average, we may come up with 3 or 4 years where it's unusually low or unusually high. Typically, what we're more concerned about is the scenario where we have 3 or 4 years of unusually high crashes, where it comes to our desk and on our radar as a problem site. And what we're trying to account for and focus on is investing in projects where the changes we make have a direct impact on reducing the crashes, as compared to just to the problem of investing in a site where it's just the treatment is not going to influence a reduction in crashes. It just experience by random nature of crashes themselves, an unusually high 3 or 4 year period. So to control for that regression to the mean, which is what we call that, we can deploy some statistical approaches to address that. And that's where the use of the observed crash history in combination with the predicted model performance together using a weighting structure through empirical Bayes is to date the best approach to address this regression to the mean effect. And why is this important? Well, let's consider the scenario where I'm trying to evaluate the effectiveness of a treatment. So for some reason, I used the short-term trend of an unusual 3-period peak to assess the effect of a treatment. So I used this high watermark of crashes as the benchmark or baseline for which I estimated the long-term average. I applied a treatment that year and then evaluated the effect of that treatment to be the low water mark shown here, which gave me a perceived effectiveness of that treatment that overrepresents the impact because it accounts and includes the regression to the mean effect for that treatment. So had we done nothing, the long-term average of crashes would have regressed down to the blue line, where the true impact of that treatment is the difference between that long-term average and the new long-term average for the site. So this is, again, at the core why addressing the regression to the mean bias is important, especially when quantifying the effects of certain treatments we put out there through the development of CMFs or crash modification factors. If we don't account for that RTM, we may be overestimating the benefits of a potential countermeasure we deploy. So how do we deploy this EB adjustment? In essence, what we're doing is we are taking the 3-year crash average, observed crash history for the site, and in combination with that, the predicted crash performance for that site together using a weighting structure. And when we combine observed to predicted, we get the third term in the HSM for crashes called expected. And this is how, generally speaking, it would look visually. Excuse me. You can see on the SPF, we have the predicted crashes. So for instance, for a given ADT on a freeway lane or freeway facility, that segment, given that ADT under a set of conditions, would experience or predict this average number of crashes. Our site may have experienced this observed crash performance over the last 3 years. To address the regression of the mean phenomena, what we do is apply a weight associated with the observed crash history and apply 1 minus that weight to the predicted, and then combine those two to come up with an expected crash frequency, which is a more reliable estimate of the long-term average. Okay, so going back to that scale and scope document of safety assessment methods, you may say to yourself, well, I want to use EB whenever I can, because it's a more accurate representation of that long-term average when evaluating the either changes that are resulting from future design that I'm considering, or evaluating for a specific one project versus another, which is more worthy of funding. Well, there are certain conditions necessary for you to be able to deploy the empirical Bayes. Without reading the slide, let me just suggest to you, first, let's think about it this way. If it's a new facility, I have no crash history. So I have no observed crashes for the site. So I can't use EB because I don't have the observed crash history. So if it's a new design or a new roadway, it kind of eliminates the possibility of using EB. On the flip side, if there's no SPF or predictive method for the facility type we're examining, and I do have observed crash history, I can't use EB because I can't get the predictive estimate for that. On top of that, for cases where I do have observed crash history and there is an SPF, okay, we can apply the EB if there's no substantive changes to the roadway geometrics and traffic control. Meaning I'm not going from unsignalized to a signalized intersection. If any time from the before to the after, you're shifting out of the facility type that we're using to predict, it renders EB not applicable. Why? Because the observed crash history for that facility when it was an unsignalized intersection is not relevant to the change we're making as a signalized intersection. So I'm basically changing the facility type, rendering the observed crash history meaningless for the new crash or for the new facility type. So that's where that first bullet, there can be no change in traffic control or major change into the geometrics, meaning adding lanes or so on and so forth. The roadway cross section is modified, but the number of through lanes remains the same, meaning we didn't shift out of the SPF category that we were in the initial existing condition analysis. You have minor changes to the alignment or a weaving section can be added. These are the conditions necessary that would make EB applicable. It's not applicable if we add lanes or change the alignment, or we have crossroad ramp terminals that change the number of approach legs. Any physical changes to the facility that would render us shifting out of one SPF to another category, we basically eliminate the possibility of using EB. Okay, and then within the Highway Safety Manual, they have this flow chart of the process by which we'll walk through, and we'll get into this a little bit more tomorrow. I'm going to jump off. Arturo had a question here looking at the Q&A. Have the crash forecasting tools been used to do backcasts that are then compared to actual historical data? Great question. So I kind of view this as validation, or what typically happens once we finish a project, we put it on a shelf and we move on to put out the next fire that comes across our desk. I think there's value in going back, and in order for us, these models are kind of like plants or pets. They need to be fed. They need to be, and in this case, fed data. They need to be modified to adjust and address changes that exist within our infrastructure. So every so often you want to do an evaluation to validate or vet the models to make sure they are an accurate reflection of the current relationship that exists between driver, vehicle, roadway interrelationships. So what you're describing there in terms of backcasting is an appropriate methodology in the life of this DDSA for a jurisdiction. It involves an iterative procedure where we're constantly updating and evaluating the validity of existing models. This is why this whole process of DDSA is a never-ending, well, I guess it will end once we get to a point where our vehicle fleet infrastructure and our roadway infrastructure is lined with widgets and monitors that are evaluating performance both of drivers as well as the roadway infrastructure and assets, so that so long as you're complying with a set of driver conditions, you have free reign to operate. But much like, for example, the earlier discussion I was talking about with these new vehicles that keep you in your lane, so long as you're within the lane, you drive away. But if you sway, the vehicle takes over and brings you back and corrects for you. I would envision that in the future, when does DDSA kind of diminish its role or shift its role to focus on how to optimize infrastructure from an operational perspective? When we have redundant chips or widgets on vehicles and the infrastructure assets that are monitoring performance constantly and protecting individuals from themselves and those around them. Now, will that happen in my lifetime? I don't think so. But I envision we can get to zero through technology and the use of technology in the infrastructure. But until we get to that point, we have to constantly update these models. And backcasting is one approach. And it's a great question, Richard. Great. Okay, so for our highway safety analysis, as we start to wrap up this first day here, setting this up, and tomorrow we'll jump into this and apply this to the example of I-70. First, we identify the limits of our project and the facility type. We establish a study period. We need data. So that data includes ADT and crash data, hopefully, if it's available. If it's not, we can still use and apply the models for predictive purposes. And we need that broken up for intersections versus segments. We need our traffic control conditions as well as our geometric attributes, lane width, shoulder width, and type, stop control, signalized lighting, and so on and so forth. And then what we do, similar to the highway capacity manual, we separate our project into homogeneous sections, and we analyze each individual homogeneous segment together or individually, and then group them together as a whole by summing up the crashes on each individual segment. And then we also assign the observed crashes to these individual sites. The HSM worksheets, and what I encourage you to do for homework before tomorrow is, if you go, let me escape out of here for a moment. And I'm going to segue back for a second to the highwaysafetymanual.org website. If you download I would encourage you to download and play around with all four of the spreadsheets. But if you download each of these spreadsheets and open it up and start playing around with it, you'll get a feel and a flavor for what we're going to get into tomorrow. So within this spreadsheet for ISAT-E, you'll notice there are 4 freeway segment pages, 3 speed lane worksheet pages, a page for freeway barrier worksheets. There's 2 for EB, 4 for ramp segments, 1 for ramp barriers, and 4 for ramp terminals. So there's 19 total worksheets that exist for our suite of freeway facility analytical elements. So we'll dive into this a little bit more tomorrow, but to show you what the ISAT-E looks like, Here's an image of the initial, once you download it. This is the first worksheet, which gives you the basic project information elements. So you have general information related to the projects, and then it also provides the crash data description that you're going to give this spreadsheet. And I'll get into that in a little more detail tomorrow. A week from tomorrow, we will get into the IHSDM and how to apply these same concepts within the context of the IHSDM. And the IHSDM user interface is a little bit different, and the learning curve associated with that is a little bit steeper if you haven't been exposed to it. Now, one question that often comes up: why would you use one versus another tool? Well, let me preface this by saying most of us, having no experience with IHSDM, have at some point in our life used Excel in a spreadsheet format. So initially, it's my expectation that the learning curve for ISAT-E is going to be much less steep, or I guess less steep than that for IHSDM. So it's more familiar, these Excel spreadsheets. Another reason the ISAT-E, they have explicitly show the CMFs for each of the attributes in the output summary, which gives you guidance as it relates to the impact of the design elements on safety. And it also familiarizes users with project attributes through that segmentation process. On the flip side, why would we use IHSDM? Well, the benefit of IHSDM is if you're dealing with a CAD-based or a project that you have in some CAD-based format, you can upload that very easily into IHSDM, and it will automatically segment the project for you. So there's, for larger scale, larger scope projects that are digitized, there's a benefit to using IHSDM in terms of that segmentation, because it does take up time. Another asset, it implements the entire HSM Part C as intended. And it's able to apply methods to non-freeway facilities. So for instance, if I use the spreadsheets for freeways, and then I have a connecting road to that freeway facility at the interchange, that's a 2-lane rural highway, I would then have to go pull down the 2-lane rural highway spreadsheet and run separate analysis for that. In IHSDM, I could do multiple facility types all within the IHSDM. Another benefit to the IHSDM are the files that can be uploaded. GeoPack, inroads, CAD, anything converted to land XML can be imported. The other benefit, the highway viewer in IHSDM provides a graphical display of the output and tables. And then finally, there's a calibration utility within the IHSDM that can help through the calibration process. Both approaches should deliver the same result. They're a consistent deployment of the HSM crash prediction methodology. The ISAT-E requires Excel spreadsheets for non-freeway components. The facility segmentation we do manually for our ISAT-E, and all input values are entered manually. For IHSDM, there's a steeper learning curve. The entire cross-section data is entered manually. CMF's values are not included in the output, and it can be perceived by some users as a black box where you're not seeing what's going on behind the scenes. So this kind of slide captures across all the facility types the different approaches and software tools that can be deployed to analyze using highway safety manual prediction methodologies for our projects. So you can see we have from the hsm.org website the conventional spreadsheet packages for 2-lane rural, multi-lane rural, urban, suburban. Then we have ISAT-E to deal with freeways, ramps, and ramp junctions. So we can do the spreadsheets for all the facility types. but they're going to be differing spreadsheets. So if you cross over from one facility type to another, you're going to have to download a separate spreadsheet and do it independently, the analysis. Whereas in IHSDM, soup to nuts, across different facility types, they can all be done, but there's a much steeper learning curve. Okay, that concludes the first session, and I've got about 4 to 5 minutes of Q&A here. If there's any comments, let me check to see. So Marilyn Sikot Husan, wondering if there's a CMF available for reversible lane or transit lane for arterials. If we don't find the CMF in the clearinghouse and don't have time or budget for developing a CMF, what would be your suggestion regarding the CMF? Okay, great question. And I mean, not even just for this application here, reversible lanes, which I'm not familiar with the current procedures in the HSM being able to deal with reversible lanes. I haven't checked this clearinghouse yet to see that, but let me do that now while we're here. If I segue over, I'll go to the clearinghouse. Let me share my screen again. And what at the clearinghouse, what I typically do would be freeway reversible lane. Whoops. And I don't see anything there. Let me also suggest here, at least for today, in closing out today's workshop, Part D is the CMF clearinghouse. This is a warehouse of CMFs that have been developed independent of the Part C methods. And if I go back and show you today, how many CMFs are there? If I just click search with nothing in there, you'll see, oops, there are 8,383 CMFs in the clearinghouse today. This, about 10 years ago, we started this clearinghouse, and there were maybe 500 CMFs when this website was initially deployed. Fed Highway manages this website through a contractor at the University of North Carolina, the Highway Safety Research Center there. What I mean to say by dealing with the fact that Fed Highway is managing this, we are not Google. So what I just did with respect to the search on freeway reversible lanes, it came up with no results. If you get too specific when going in doing a search within the clearinghouse, it's likely you will end up with 0 results. So what I typically do is make the research more generic. And if it wasn't locked up on me here, I would, and maybe I'll start off tomorrow's session by doing this. What I would do is just, instead of saying freeway reversible lanes, I would just type in reversible lanes and search it that way. So I will start tomorrow's lecture with this discussion topic because it's an important question. There are not always going to be CMFs applicable to what it is you're proposing, and how to deal with that depends on the resources available. In some cases, we won't be able to analyze some of the designs that we're considering. Any other questions? If I hear none, then we will meet back tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. I'll turn it back over to Taylor for anything to close out. But I appreciate everybody's time and attention today, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow, where we'll jump into ISAT-E. Taylor, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, John, for an excellent introduction to the Highway Safety Manual today. And thank you to all of our attendees for participating in this first session of the Data-Driven Safety Analysis Virtual Workshop Series. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow, Friday, September 15th, for our second session. That will also start at 9 a.m. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day, and talk to you soon.
See y'all tomorrow.